Сегодня наш собеседник, профессор Свободного университета в Берлине, политический аналитик, политолог Клаус Зегберс. Добрый день, Клаус.
Привет. Здравствуйте. Здравствуйте. Мы договорились, Клаус, что мы будем вас спрашивать по-русски, а вы будете отвечать нам по-английски. Я сразу предваряю для читателей и говорю, это особенность нашего разговора. И твой первый вопрос, Саша, пожалуйста.
Первый вопрос. Как современный популизм в Западной Европе и в Германии имеет какие-то особенности, которых нет ни у российского, ни у американского популизма? Есть что-то, например, в Германии, что не похоже на все остальные варианты? Есть ли национальная специфика популизма? Или это явление глобального мира и одинаковое во всех странах?
I do think that, first of all, populism all over the world is rising in all continents. And I also do think that there are joint features. And the most relevant feature probably is that we are facing an increasing uncertainty in many societies. So many people don't quite understand what is going on related to globalization and some other developments. And the more people feel uncertainty, the more they obviously are open for being perceptive to populist activities. Having said that, and I think we can elaborate on that a little bit later, you are asking about specifics in Europe. There is one specific feature in Europe which cannot be in other countries or other continents, and that is the existence of the European Union. Those countries in and around Europe who are interested in becoming a member, they have to oblige themselves to voluntarily transfer part of their sovereignty upward to the EU. That is a voluntary transfer of sovereignty. And that opens new doors to populist activities and argumentations, because populists all the time keep complaining about the loss of sovereignty. And they promise their people, in quotation marks, their people, that once they are in power, they will regain sovereignty. So that is obviously a different kind of discussion in Europe as opposed to the United States or Asia or other parts of the world. So I think this particular feature, the existence of the EU, is the most relevant difference.
Скажите, Клаус, а каким образом оказывается, что то, что раньше было надеждой объединенной Европы, там, например, открытые границы и глобализация, превращается в предмет опасений?
There is one factor which heavily influences the whole equation, and that is that in the last 20-25 years, pretty much after the collapse of the USSR and after the end of the Cold War, we increasingly are facing something which I call the rise of global flows. So we have the rise of capital flows. The financial crisis in 2007-2008 was one documentation of that. We have the rise of people who are migrating. So global migration is also a factor. And also content flows like in the internet, and entertainment flows like streaming, and many other things. And all those flows, the global flows, are border crossing. They are border crossing, but they cannot really effectively be monitored and controlled by national governments. And so from the people's position in many societies, the governments increasingly look like helpless and hapless in facing these global flows. So the globalization, which for many people was related also with hopes and opportunities, which is still the case, I would argue, increasingly is turning into a challenge and into constraints, because the people have the impression that the governments cannot effectively control and moderate these global flows. So logically, they turn to people who argue we have to regain our national sovereignty, and once we will be able to regain that, everything will be better. I do think that is a fallacy. That's not going to happen. But people tend to believe in that.
Но почему всегда оказывается, что те решения, которые находятся, и те заключения, которые предлагаются именно со стороны популистов, это простые ответы. Это то, что Клаус называет постановкой новых стен, да, возникновением границ там, где они прежде были уничтожены и ликвидированы.
Yes, that is the establishment of new and old borders and frontiers. At least the perspective to do that, because in global times it is not really possible to do that. So it is more a promise, and as you rightly said in your question, it is a promise to find simple solutions for actually very complex problems. But the question is not is that realistic or not, the question is do people believe in it? And as long as people believe in it, it is politically a very powerful strategy and a very powerful tool.
Саша, пожалуйста.
Можно ли назвать популистов полностью безответственными политиками? Или они собираются взять за что-то ответственность, и все-таки за их программы стоит какая-то политическая реальная ответственность?
Once they are elected, and increasingly we find that populists are elected into government positions, they obviously have to share responsibility and also to accept some kind of responsibility for what they are doing. There is no way around that. Another question is how the people will evaluate their job. So what we can observe, and that's quite interesting from a political kind of perspective, is that the expectation that once populists are voted into offices, they have responsibility, they have to act, and then they have to run again for their offices, that this would sober up the populists and also the people, and populists may become less popular once they are in office. So this expectation so far is not necessarily holding true, because if we look to some records, election records, for example, look to Hungary, the twice re-election of Mr. Orban, Prime Minister Orban, to the election results in Poland and some other countries, it does not seem that populists very quickly are disguised and are turning out to be incapable of handling their tasks. And one of the reasons for this is that populists are very good in creating a certain image of tribes. So populists are tribal people. They appeal to people's hopes and aspirations, and what they promise is something like identity politics. That is a very crucial concept for understanding what is going on here. Populists are serving identity politics, and the people are longing for identities. And here we have a linkage, here we have a match between the aspirations of people and the promises of populists.
Но почему статусные политики, официальный истеблишмент не в состоянии в такой степени выразить ценности масс, какой это удается делать популистам? И как оказывается, что фактически повторяется ситуацию, которую в свое время Уолтер Лакер, насколько я помню, описывал в связи с тем, что происходило в перестройку в рядах русских правых. Он говорит, что невозможно отдавать вопросы национального интереса и патриотизма в руки правых. Сейчас то, что мы наблюдаем в связи с популизмом, это фактически этот процесс передачи вопросов о национальном интересе и патриотизме в руки правых. Почему это лучше удается делать популистам, а не статусным политикам?
Politicians and decision makers, including also journalists, media people, and corporate people, who have a lot of responsibility. They know about the limits of what can be done when you have political office or corporate office or whatever. And while politicians certainly in election times often or pretty much always promise more than they can deliver, there are some breaks in that what they are doing and proposing compared with populists, because they know about the responsibility. So the classical traditional politicians cannot promise, for example, to stop immigration more or less completely. They cannot promise to stop capital flows or the internet or whatever, because they know it is not possible. Now the populists don't feel these kind of constraints and limitations, and they keep promising whatever they think is good for them and for their success. And increasingly many people, we talked about it already, who are disappointed about the deliveries of national politicians, they turn to these populists' promises. Look to Italy. The last elections in Italy gave a result that from the right and the left, two populist movements and parties, the Five Star movement and also the Lega party, gained 50% of all votes. So half of Italy is voting populist, because they don't believe the promises of traditional politicians. Because these traditional politicians, again, are normally more restrained in what they think they can and should promise. The populists don't feel this kind of constraints.
Могут ли популисты, Клаус, вписаться потом в партийную политику? Обычно о популизме говорят как о политике вне партии, свидетельствующей о кризисе традиционной партии, но могут ли они начать заниматься партийной политикой и стать такой этаблированной, успешной частью официальной политики на многие годы?
Absolutely, yes, and that is what they are doing, and that is what is happening, because if they do not create parties, if they do not create their own parties, they cannot participate in elections. So when they want to run for office or participating in parliamentarian elections or presidential elections, whatever, they have to have a party. So the two Italian organizations I mentioned are now technically parties. The Alternative for Germany and the leftists in Germany are parties, right? So more and more populists do have parties, and they use these parties, but they use them in a specific way, which is different from the usage of traditional parties.
Скажите, пожалуйста, Клаус, а каким образом вообще представить себе будущее, если говорить о перспективе? Как вы считаете, Евросоюз справится с поставленной перед ним задачей все-таки? Насколько отсутствие свободы рук национальных политиков и наличие Евросоюза мешает справляться, а не помогает с этими вызовами политикам?
I do think that the existence of the EU is a big asset and not a big problem. Mm-hmm. So when the EU would not be around, actually we would have to create it today. That is my perspective. But when you talk to younger people, these young people, fortunately, I give you one or two examples, do not have any kind of personal recollections on a war, right? But the older generation in Europe, they still remembers that we had wars in the 20th century and that 2 world wars were emerging from European soil. The EU, first of all, was a project to avoid future wars. And this succeeded. Ever since the EU was created, we did not have inside the EU a new war. But young people don't appreciate that because they were born into peace. So for them, that is the natural status to be in. So they don't see it as an advancement, right? The same goes for free traveling. All over Europe, once you are here, you can travel freely to other countries. That is also something. When I was like a kid and a teenager, we didn't have that, right? But today's young people are born into a Europe where they can travel freely. So we have a problem in perception, and younger people discount the advantages. And also it is much easier for the EU to cope with some effects of globalization than for individual nation states, because you have a bloc of 28 still, in the future 27 countries, which jointly can set priorities and act in the global scene. So it is a big advantage to have the EU. The question is that not all people in Europe are appreciating as such, because they still think the national governments are the first addressees for politics, and then they are disappointed when the national governments cannot deliver. I think that is the core problem.
Клаус, вы в большей степени говорите, сейчас вот на протяжении нашего разговора как-то у нас выходит так, оказывается, что вы в большей степени говорите, собственно, не о политических курсах, не о политических программах, не о политических планах и не о политических перспективах, а об эмоциях, о вере, об убежденности людей, о загипнотизированности событиями и так далее. Скажите, пожалуйста, в какой момент эта эмоциональная составляющая становится доминантой в Европе? В какой момент эмоции перехлестывают политические планы?
I guess it is the very moment when people feel threatened along two lines. One threat may be directed to their social economic situation, and that concerns to some extent also middle class people or lower middle class people. And one of the biggest challenges here is automatization and artificial intelligence. So many jobs as we know them will disappear in the next 10 to 15 years completely. For example, professional drivers. Bus drivers, taxi drivers, all kinds of professional drivers are not needed in the future anymore because cars will be self-driving cars. There are many other professional groups which will disappear. So that is a social economic challenge which is perceived, and rightly so, by many people as a personal challenge as well. And the second challenge, which many people see for themselves, is not so much related to economics, but rather to, I talked about it before, rather to identities. They feel threatened in their identity as they have developed it for years and decades. Like, I give you also an example, the Democratic Party for a long time was the party in the United States which mostly were defending the rights and interests of the white working class in the US. But in the last couple of years, 10 years, 15 years, the Democratic Party increasingly moved away from representing the white working class and rather was expressing interests of minorities, like immigrants, handicapped people, people of color, gay people, transgender people, and the representation of women in the board of corporate organizations. So I'm not saying that that is wrong. I think that are worthwhile causes, right? But from the position of the white working class, the reorientation of the Democratic Party to entitlements, protecting entitlements for minorities, was something like betrayal, because then the white workers were asking, who is representing us? Everyone is talking about minorities. And they perceive this as a threat for themselves. Logically, they do not keep voting for the Democratic Party. So I gave you two examples here, automatization and minority entitlements, which obviously lead to the situation that people who traditionally vote like for socialist parties, social democratic parties, whatever, feel lost, and then they turn around and go for populist solutions.
Да, Клаус, обычно мы говорим о популизме только отрицательно. А есть в этом явлении что-то положительное, какие-то возможности для Европы, а не только разрушительные тенденции.
Well, normally, probably we would expect that a political scientist, a social scientist, has the ability to look at things from different sides, right? And I think that is a good thing to do. But frankly, when I look at populism from different sides, no matter from how many sides, I still come to the conclusion that on balance, it is not a good development. It is basically making promises to people and suggesting simplified solutions which cannot work. The problem is here not only the supply side, that we have populist people who supply solutions which will not work. The problem is also, and even more so, that we have demand. So it's a supply and a demand situation. There is demand for populism from many people, and increasingly so. And the demand side is also characterized by something else. Historically, when you look back a long time, when democracy was emerging in the ancient Greek city-states, right? Democracy was closely linked with a certain level of knowledge. So you have to have a citizen status, and you had to have a certain level of knowledge, and then you also could vote and take decisions. Today, we do not have that anymore. Everybody has a driver's license, everybody is entitled to get and make kids, and everybody is entitled to vote beyond 18 or 20 or whatever years, right? No matter if this person has any kind of idea and clue about the subjects of politics, which are dependent on his or her voting behavior. So this mismatch or gap between the right to vote and the level of knowledge of these people is a major problem, I think, because the world is ever getting more complex. It is migration issues, it is the Iran and Korea issue, proliferation, it is automatization and production, artificial intelligence, it is demographic developments, it is dozens of things, and most people don't understand them really. I think our task in the academia and the media and beyond has to be how we can at least partly remedy that people get some kind of interpretations, narratives to kind of understand what is going on. I think the level of misunderstanding or not knowing or cluelessness is one of the biggest challenges we are facing, and we have to think along these lines.
Клаус, скажите, пожалуйста, вот вчера мы столкнулись с замечательной формулировкой Дональда Трампа относительно иммигрантов, что они являются животными, да? В какой степени вообще изменяется сама ценностная система, которая стоит за современным европейским массовым человеком, скажем так, в традициях Ортеги и Гассета? Что меняется в восприятии врагов? Каким образом видится этот, может быть, новый враг, или он представляется так, как представлялись и старые враги, как и прежние недруги представлялись? Точно так же. Это какие-то монстры, это люди, за которыми стоят преступления и так далее. Как описывается сама структура, сама фигура врага, я так сформулирую.
I think there are two issues or two problems related to populism, and so far we were focusing on the political side. Mm-hmm. But there is also another side, and that is the side of habits and customs and communication. And this quote, what you had from yesterday, there are hundreds of other quotes we could add to that from the same person in the United States, but also from the Brexit campaign and from other countries. So what is happening here is that the spaces of communication and the limitations for these spaces, what is acceptable in terms of behavior, что положено, что принято, that is changing. You find a tendency among many politicians, many populist politicians, to be rude, uncivilized. They cut you off. They shout. They violate all kinds of rules of the acceptable in the traditional public spaces. And that is a problem as well, because how do we cope with that? I remember that Michelle Obama once, after a certain incident with Trump, said, when they go low, we go high. So in other words, we don't lower ourselves to such a level of communication. But there's a problem, as I agree with that. But there's a problem with that as well. When someone cuts you off in a TV studio, in a discussion, in a roundtable discussion or whatever, right? You either have the option to let it go and wait for the next opportunity to continue your ideas. Or you have the opportunity to shout back and to cut the other person off as well, and also to be rude and use words, right? So how are we behaving here? When you shout back, you lower yourself on this level of communication, which I think is not particularly civilized and not good. But when you don't do that, you look weak, and the other side perceives itself as the winner. So the refixation of the limits of the acceptable in public spaces is one of the major issues we are facing here. How do we defend certain limits of behavior without looking weak? I think that is one of the core questions for the future.
Клаус, часто высказывают опасения, что популизм может перерасти в неофашизм или неонацизм. При том, что популисты называют своими врагами только иммигрантов, но есть ли опасность, что, например, популизм объединится со старым антисемитизмом, неонацизмом, ультраправыми, например, в Венгрии и в других странах перейдут и к поиску внутренних, или в Германии внутренних врагов, а не только мигрантов?
I'm a little bit hesitant to mix up different concepts, especially when these concepts were evolving and changing over a long period of time, right? So I think after 5 or so years of debating populism, we know now a couple of things how to define populism. It is always about staging a dichotomy between the pure elites and between the elites and the pure people. That is always there. It is always ranting against mainstream media. It is against immigration, it is against transborder trade, and in Europe it is against the EU. It is more a discursive style than an ideology. So these things we kind of know. I don't really see the necessity to merge it with other concepts, because when we say there may be something like fascism or authoritarianism or whatever, that very much depends on how you understand these other concepts, and it rather creates new uncertainties than it gives you any kind of insights. Yes, with some features of historical fascism, there are similarities, but do we need this concept of fascism to talk in a meaningful way about populism? I do not think so. I think we make it more complicated when we borrow these kind of other concepts than we gain any kind of additional insight.
Клаус, скажите, пожалуйста, ведь если говорить о Трампе или говорить о Марин Ле Пен, вообще говорить о лидерах популистского толка, то оказывается, что, относясь к элитам, эти лидеры не признают своей принадлежности к ним. Одновременно, параллельно, уже давно идет критика европейских элит, критика Брюсселя, и эта критика принимает форму мегаломании. Можно ли говорить о кризисе элит действительно, и можно ли говорить, что популизм играет роль катализатора этого кризиса?
Of course, можно говорить об этом, но you can talk about it, but I'm not quite sure that this is promising, and that brings us a lot further in understanding what is going on. I do not think that the quality of the elites we are having now in Europe or in the United States or in Asia is fundamentally different from the quality of elites we had like 30 or 50 years ago. I do think basically it is the same kind of people with the same kind of education and socialization and whatever. But the context is different, right? So when you look at the agenda, on the agenda, what decision makers are facing, what kind of challenges they are facing 50 years ago, 30 years ago. The things which had to be solved then were, first of all, less, so the agendas were not so crowded as today. Is everyone still on board? Hello?
Да-да-да, мы здесь, мы слушаем.
So first of all, the agendas were shorter than today, and second, they were less complex. Today, I could enumerate to you 12 to 15 highly relevant issues in politics European, American, East European, Asian decision makers are facing every single day. They cannot say, okay, now we do the Euro crisis, and in 3-4 months we move on to migration, and then in 4 or 5 months we move on to Iran and Korea. That's not possible. You have to address everything simultaneously. And there is simply no way that, no matter about the quality of the elites and their education and the kind of understanding or whatever, they can reasonably solve plenty of that in a short period of time. It's just not possible because the context changed a lot. And that makes them looking helpless and helpless and unprofessional sometimes. But it's not about, at the end of the day, it's not about the quality of the people, but it is about that we have much more things which are lying on our tables and desks, and we have to address it in one way or the other. I think that is the more important problem.
Спасибо, Клаус. И последний вопрос. Могли бы вы сопоставить политические стратегии Владимира Путина и западных популистов? Как вы считаете, здесь есть точки соприкосновения, какие-то параллели возникают, или русский популизм вообще какой-то особенный кейс?
Like mostly in life you have similarities and you have differences, but I do think that The similarities are rather in the sphere of challenges. So for EU countries and for Russia, there is a challenge by default because of accelerating globalization. So each country and all politicians in one way or the other have to address that, right? But the consequences people are reaching from that are different. I think one of the core issues of Russia is a more or less stagnant modernization. So there is a very selective and hesitant reaction to globalization pressure, which has to do a lot with some things we cannot probably stop it extensively today, but Russia is still a very one-sided economy, has a very one-sided economy. It is mostly energy-based. That is defended by the current rulers in Russia because when they would diversify the economy, they are afraid they also have to diversify the social structure of Russia and the political form of governance. So that's not going to happen. So that is certainly different from Western countries, right, where you have not one-sided economies in the sense of the Russian energy-based economy. That is one thing. In terms of reactions, I also think that the small group of the real rulers in Russia is not only very fixated on this energy thing, what they do not want to change, but also into their own future, and not in the sense of elections. The Russian politicians in the center in Moscow, they don't have to worry about elections, as we have seen again, and may also see in the future. Elections, on the contrary, in Western countries are creating a lot of uncertainty because in Western countries, the ruling people never quite know if they will be re-elected or not, right? Look to many governments, to many individuals who were out of office in a very short period of time and sometimes unexpectedly. So that creates a lot of uncertainty, which is regulated by rules, by institutions in Western countries, not so much in Russia. So there are more differences. But basically, the pressure to react in one way or the other to the global challenges, that is similar, but the reactions are quite different.
Спасибо, Клаус. Это было очень продуктивное общение. Мы благодарим вас и надеемся на возобновление диалога. Спасибо. Всего доброго.
Спасибо вам.
До свидания.